Rain tapped against the windshield as Anthony drove through the quiet streets of Westbrook. He checked his watch and sighed. The meeting with the district attorney was in 30 minutes, and he couldn't afford to be late. Not today. The case he'd been building for months depended on this meeting. The flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror came out of nowhere. What now? Anthony muttered, carefully pulling his black sedan to the curb. He had been driving exactly at the speed limit, his registration was current, and his brake lights were working perfectly. He checked everything just yesterday. Officer Rickard watched the luxury car for a moment before stepping out of his patrol car. 15 years on the force had given him a certain swagger, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. The other officers at the station knew his reputation, even if they rarely spoke about it openly. The black residents of Westbrook definitely knew it. As Rickard approached, Anthony already had his license and registration ready, placing them on the dashboard where they were clearly visible. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but Anthony kept his window rolled up until the officer tapped on it with his knuckles. "Good morning, officer," Anthony said politely as he lowered his window. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" Rickard's face remained stern. His eyes narrowed as he gave Anthony a once-over, taking in the tailored suit and silk tie. "You match the description of someone involved in a convenience store robbery last night." Anthony blinked in surprise. "A robbery? There must be some mistake." "License and registration," Rickard demanded, ignoring Anthony's confusion. "They're right here on the dashboard, sir," Anthony replied, pointing to the documents he'd already prepared. Rickard took the documents, examining them with exaggerated scrutiny. "Step out of the vehicle." "Officer, I'm on my way to an important meeting. I'm already running late and—" "I said step out of the vehicle," Rickard interrupted, his hand moving to rest on his holster. "Now." Anthony took a deep breath. He knew this dance all too well. Stay calm. Don't make sudden movements. Be respectful but firm about your rights. He'd given this advice to countless young men in his community. Now he needed to follow it himself. "Am I under arrest, officer?" Anthony asked, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "You're being detained for questioning," Rickard replied. "Don't make this difficult." The rain had picked up again as Anthony carefully stepped out of his car. The water soaked into his expensive suit, but that was the least of his worries now. "Turn around. Hands against the vehicle." "Officer, this is unnecessary." I don't care what you are," Rickard cut him off. "Hands against the vehicle now." Anthony complied, feeling the cold metal of handcuffs close around his wrists moments later. The indignity burned, but he kept his composure. Nearby, a young woman had stopped on the sidewalk, quietly recording the scene with her phone. Anthony caught her eye and gave her a small nod. "I have the right to know what specific crime I'm being suspected of," Anthony stated firmly as Rickard roughly patted him down. "Like I said, convenience store robbery. Matching your description. Black male, well-dressed, driving a fancy car." There was something in the way Rickard emphasized these details that made it clear the description was paper-thin. "That's hardly a specific description," Anthony pointed out. "And I was at a dinner with colleagues last night until 10 p.m. There are dozens of witnesses." "Tell it to the judge," Rickard snorted, guiding Anthony toward the patrol car. "You people always have an excuse." The comment made Anthony's jaw tighten, but he said nothing as he was placed in the back seat of the cruiser. Through the window, he could see his car sitting there, likely to be towed. His phone was still inside, along with his briefcase containing critical documents for the morning meeting. "Officer, I need to make a phone call. I have a constitutional right to." "You'll get your phone call at the station," Rickard said dismissively, slamming the door shut. As they drove away, Anthony closed his eyes and took measured breaths. The irony wasn't lost on him. Today of all days, if Rickard only knew who he had just arrested, things would have gone very differently. But soon enough he would find out. And when he did, Officer Rickard would learn a hard lesson about jumping to conclusions and abusing his power. The rain drummed steadily on the roof of the police car as they headed toward the station, neither man aware of how this ordinary traffic stop was about to change both their lives forever. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Anthony was led through the booking area. His expensive suit, now wrinkled and damp from the rain, stood in stark contrast to the dingy surroundings. Several officers glanced up from their desks, some with curiosity, others barely paying attention to yet another person being brought in. "Stand against the wall," Officer Rickard barked, pointing to a height chart for the mugshot. Anthony complied silently, his face a mask of calm despite the storm of emotions inside him. As the camera flashed, he thought about the dozen calls he was missing, the crucial meeting that had started without him, and the case files sitting locked in his car. "Name?" asked a bored-looking desk sergeant, not bothering to look up from his computer. Before Anthony could answer, Rickard cut in. "Anthony Washington. Claims he's some big shot who couldn't possibly rob a convenience store." The sergeant raised an eyebrow but continued typing. "I have not claimed anything except my innocence," Anthony said evenly. "And I'd like to make my phone call now." "Systems backed up," Rickard said with a shrug that didn't even try to hide its insincerity. "You'll get your call when we get to it." Anthony watched as Rickard leaned over to another officer nearby. "These guys always think the rules don't apply to them," he said, not bothering to keep his voice down. "Always got some excuse or some cousin who's a lawyer." The other officer glanced uncomfortably at Anthony, then back to his paperwork without responding. "Actually," Anthony said, his voice firm but controlled, "I work in the legal field myself." Rickard let out a laugh. "Yeah, and I'm the Attorney General. Everyone's a lawyer when they're in cuffs." He turned to the desk sergeant. "Get his prints and put him in holding until we sort this out." A young female officer approached with the fingerprinting equipment. Unlike Rickard, she treated Anthony with basic decency, quietly guiding his fingers onto the scanner. "I don't suppose you could tell me when I might get that phone call?" Anthony asked her softly. "I'll see what I can do," she whispered back, her eyes darting to make sure Rickard wasn't watching. After fingerprinting, Anthony was led to a holding cell already containing 3 other men. The cell smelled of sweat and disinfectant, with graffiti scratched into the bench that ran along the wall. One man slept in the corner, another paced nervously, while the third stared blankly ahead. New friend joining the party, Rickard announced as he unlocked the cell. "Play nice, boys." The door clanged shut behind Anthony, the sound echoing through the small space. He sat down on the bench, careful to maintain some distance from the others. "What they get you for?" asked the man who had been pacing. "Apparently, driving while black," Anthony replied quietly. The man nodded knowingly. "Rickard." Anthony looked up in surprise. "Yes, you know him." "Everybody in the East Side knows Rickard," the man said, shaking his head. "Got a special thing for pulling over anyone with a nice car who doesn't look like they should own a nice car, if you know what I mean." "I'm beginning to understand," Anthony said. Hours crawled by. The sleeping man was eventually released. A new person was brought in, then taken out for questioning. Anthony had requested his phone call several times when officers passed by, but was consistently ignored or told to wait. 6 hours after his arrest, Anthony's patience was wearing thin. The initial meeting he'd missed was long over. By now, his absence would have raised alarms in the federal prosecutor's office. He wondered if anyone had started looking for him yet. A different officer, older with gray at his temples, finally approached the cell. "Washington, your preliminary hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning." "Officer, I still haven't been allowed my phone call," Anthony said, standing up. "That's a direct violation of my rights." The older officer frowned slightly. "You haven't called anyone?" Officer Rickard said the system was backed up. Something flickered across the older officer's face, concern, perhaps, or annoyance. "Come with me," he said, unlocking the cell. He led Anthony to a phone on the wall and gave him some privacy. Anthony quickly dialed his colleague, keeping his voice low. "It's me. Listen carefully." "I've been wrongfully detained by Westbrook PD." "Yes, exactly that." "No, don't send anyone. Let this play out. Just make sure the paperwork for the Taylor case is ready. Trust me on this." When Anthony hung up, the older officer was watching him with an unreadable expression. The City Hall meeting room was packed beyond capacity. 3 months of investigation had led to this moment, a formal hearing that had drawn attention from local media, community activists, and concerned citizens. Extra chairs lined the walls, but many people still stood at the back of the room, craning their necks to see the proceedings. At the front, a long table seated the police chief, 2 city council members, the mayor, and the head of the Civilian Oversight Committee. Their faces were serious as they shuffled through the thick packets of evidence that had been distributed earlier that morning. Officer Rickard sat at a small table to the right, flanked by his union representative and a lawyer who kept whispering in his ear. Rickard looked thinner than he had 3 months ago, his uniform hanging slightly loose on his frame. The stress of being under investigation had clearly taken its toll. Anthony straightened his tie as he waited for the hearing to begin. Behind him sat his team of attorneys who had worked tirelessly to build the case, along with several of the people they had interviewed, victims of Rickard's pattern of discriminatory policing. The police chief cleared his throat. This special hearing is now in session. We are here to review the findings of Federal Prosecutor Anthony Washington regarding the conduct of Officer James Rickard. He turned to Anthony. Mr. Washington, you may begin your presentation. Anthony approached the podium, placing his notes carefully on the surface. The room fell completely silent. Thank you, Chief Williams. 3 months ago, I was wrongfully arrested by Officer Rickard while driving to a meeting. What began as a personal injustice revealed itself to be part of a much larger pattern of misconduct that this department has overlooked for years. Anthony clicked a remote, and a large screen behind him illuminated with a graph showing traffic stop statistics. The evidence I'm presenting today isn't about feelings or perceptions. It's about numbers that cannot be disputed. He pointed to the screen. Over the past 5 years, Officer Rickard has pulled over black drivers at more than 6 times the rate of white drivers in the same neighborhoods. When we control for time of day, traffic conditions, and vehicle types, the disparity becomes even more glaring. The next slide showed search rates. After pulling people over, Officer Rickard searched vehicles driven by minorities at nearly 7 times the rate of those driven by white drivers. Yet, and this is crucial, those searches yielded contraband at a significantly lower rate. From the back of the room, someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. That's because he wasn't looking for actual evidence, he was just harassing us. The police chief frowned at the interruption, but Anthony nodded slightly before continuing. The data tells us Officer Rickard wasn't making evidence-based decisions, he was acting on bias. He clicked to the next slide. We identified 27 cases with striking similarities to my own. Individuals pulled over for matching vague descriptions, subjected to searches without probable cause, and in many cases detained overnight or longer before charges were eventually dropped. Anthony motioned, and a middle-aged man in a button-up shirt stood up from the audience. This is David Torres. Last year, Officer Rickard stopped him while he was driving his son to a soccer game. He spent 3 nights in jail because he matched the description of a suspect. He lost his job as a result. No charges were ever filed. Torres nodded grimly as several heads turned to look at him. But perhaps most disturbing, Anthony continued, clicking to a new slide showing an internal email chain, is evidence that complaints against Officer Rickard were systematically buried or dismissed. Over the past decade, 23 formal complaints were filed. Not a single one resulted in disciplinary action. A murmur spread through the room. The police chief shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This email chain shows that senior officers, including Captain Reed, were instructed to mark these complaints as resolved without proper investigation. Anthony highlighted a portion of the email. I quote, "Handle the Washington complaint like the others. Mark it resolved and move on." Captain Reed, seated near Rickard, stared straight ahead, his face pale. Rickard's attorney stood up. "This is outrageous. My client is being scapegoated for departmental procedures he had no control over. Officer Rickard has served this community faithfully for 15 years. Served which community? Came a voice from the audience, an elderly black woman who had stood up. Not mine, not my grandchildren's. The mayor raised his hand for silence. Please, let's maintain order. Anthony continued methodically, presenting body camera footage that Officer Chen had saved from deletion, testimonies from other officers who had witnessed Rickard's conduct, and statistical analyses that showed the pattern beyond any reasonable doubt. For nearly 2 hours, he laid out the evidence, piece by piece, never raising his voice, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. By the time he concluded, the room was utterly silent. The evidence shows not only individual misconduct, Anthony said in closing, but a systemic failure to address it. Officer Rickard's actions reflect a culture that has permitted and protected discriminatory policing. This isn't about one bad officer, it's about accountability at every level. Rickard's attorney attempted to paint the incidents as coincidental rather than racially motivated, but his arguments sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence. The statistical patterns were simply too clear to dismiss. As the hearing drew to a close, the police chief cleared his throat. In light of the evidence presented today, Officer Rickard is suspended effective immediately, pending further departmental action. He paused, looking uncomfortable. Additionally, I am ordering a review of our complaint procedures and oversight mechanisms. It wasn't everything Anthony had hoped for, but it was a start. As the room began to clear, local reporters surrounded him, shouting questions about what would happen next. Anthony spotted Officer Chen standing by the door. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a small nod of appreciation before slipping out. Behind him, David Torres was shaking hands with other community members who had shared similar experiences. The hearing had ended, but the ripple effects were just beginning. As Anthony gathered his materials, he knew that Rickard's career was effectively over, but the fight for true accountability in the Westbrook Police Department was just beginning. 6 months after the hearing, Anthony stood at the podium in the community center of Westbrook's East Side. The room was filled with familiar faces, people he'd met during his investigation, community activists, and several police officers, including Officer Chen, who now wore a detective's badge. "Today marks a new beginning," Anthony said, looking out at the crowd. "But before we talk about where we're going, let's remember how we got here." On the wall behind him hung a framed newspaper front page with the headline, "Officer Dismissed. Investigation Reveals Years of Racial Profiling." Beside it was a newer headline, "Police Reform Bill Passes, New Oversight Board Established." The journey from that tense hearing to this moment had been neither quick nor easy. 2 weeks after the hearing, the police department had officially terminated Officer Rickard's employment. Captain Reed had been demoted and later chose early retirement rather than face further scrutiny. But the bigger changes had taken months of persistent pressure and negotiation. "When I was wrongfully arrested that rainy morning," Anthony continued, "I never imagined it would lead to this moment. But sometimes injustice, when exposed to the light, can become the catalyst for change that benefits everyone." In the front row sat David Torres, who had become one of the most vocal advocates for police reform. Beside him was Mrs. Wilson, the elderly woman who had spoken up during the hearing. Her grandson, a college student who had been stopped by Rickard multiple times, nodded as Anthony spoke. "The new Civilian Review Board isn't just a symbolic gesture," Anthony explained, gesturing to the diverse group of 7 people seated to his right. "These community members now have real power to investigate complaints, access body camera footage, and recommend disciplinary action when necessary." One of those board members was Mrs. Wilson herself, her stern expression suggesting she took the responsibility very seriously. Additionally, every officer in the Westbrook Police Department will complete the new anti-bias training program, Anthony continued, and traffic stop data will be analyzed quarterly for patterns of discrimination. Chief Williams, who had initially been defensive during the hearing, now stood at the back of the room with a more humble demeanor. The scandal had nearly cost him his job, but he had ultimately chosen to become an ally in the reform process rather than an obstacle. It was a political calculation as much as a moral awakening, but the results were the same. Real change was happening. "None of this would have been possible without people being willing to speak up," Anthony said, making eye contact with Officer Chen. Her decision to provide the body camera footage had put her career at risk, but it had also earned her the respect of colleagues who shared her commitment to fair policing. After the formal presentation ended, Anthony mingled with the community members. A young man approached him somewhat shyly. "My brother was one of the people who filed a complaint against Rickard years ago," he said. "Nobody listened then. He moved away afterward, said he couldn't live in a place where he didn't feel safe. I just called him about all this. He's thinking about moving back." Stories like this had become common in recent months, small signs that trust was slowly being rebuilt between the police department and the community it served. As the event wound down, Anthony stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The community center overlooked the park where he had played as a child, not far from where Rickard had pulled him over that fateful day. Officer Chen, now Detective Chen, joined him on the steps. "The new recruits are different," she said, following his gaze to the park. "You should see them. They're asking questions no one dared ask before. About how to build relationships, how to recognize their own biases." She smiled slightly. "The old guard doesn't quite know what to make of it." "Change never comes easy," Anthony replied. "You know, when you first got arrested, everyone in the station thought it was just bad luck that Rickard picked the wrong person to mess with," Chen said. "But it wasn't luck, was it? If he hadn't stopped you, he would have just kept going, and all those other people would never have gotten justice." Anthony nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the system only changes when it makes a mistake that can't be ignored." As the sun began to set over Westbrook, Anthony thought about how much had changed and how much hadn't. The new policies and oversight mechanisms were important, but they were just the beginning. Real change would require continued vigilance from people like Detective Chen, Mrs. Wilson, and every citizen who now understood they had the right to demand fair treatment. Later that evening, as Anthony was leaving, he passed a patrol car stopped at a traffic light. The young officer inside nodded respectfully, recognizing him. It was a small gesture, but it represented something significant, an acknowledgement that accountability wasn't the enemy of good policing, but its foundation. The wrongful arrest that had begun as a personal indignity had transformed into a movement for justice that would benefit countless others. For Anthony, that made every long night, every difficult meeting, and every moment of resistance worthwhile. The work wasn't finished, it might never be finished, but Westbrook had taken its first real steps toward becoming a community where the law truly protected everyone equally. "Everything all right?" the officer asked. Anthony nodded. "It will be, tomorrow." As he was led back to the holding cell, Anthony caught sight of Rickard chatting with another officer by the coffee machine, laughing about something. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. Anthony held his gaze steady until Rickard looked away first. Tomorrow would come, and with it, a reckoning that Officer Rickard couldn't possibly anticipate. The courthouse bustled with the usual morning activity, lawyers clutching coffee cups, clerks shuffling papers, families waiting anxiously on hard wooden benches. Officer Rickard strode through the main doors with confidence, nodding to the security guards he knew by name. He'd been through this routine hundreds of times: show up, testify about the arrest, watch another criminal get what they deserved. Today felt no different as he straightened his uniform and reviewed his notes on the Washington case. Simple robbery suspect, matched the description, resisted cooperation, the usual story. He'd embellish a bit about suspicious behavior if needed. The judge would believe him over some random guy, just like always. "Morning, Rickard," called the bailiff. "Ready to put away another bad guy?" Rickard grinned. "Just doing my job, keeping the streets safe." Courtroom 3 was already filling up when Rickard entered. He spotted the district attorney, Mr. Reynolds, organizing papers at the prosecutor's table. Rickard made his way over. "Morning, counselor. Got an easy one for you today." Reynolds looked up with a distracted expression. "Oh, Rickard. Which case is yours again?" "The convenience store robbery suspect, Anthony Washington." Reynolds frowned slightly. "Washington. I don't have that on my docket." Before Rickard could respond, a side door opened and Judge Patricia Chen entered. Everyone rose as she took her seat at the bench. "Be seated," she said, adjusting her glasses and reviewing the morning's cases. First up, State versus Thompson. The proceedings began, but Rickard felt uneasy. He scanned the rows of waiting defendants but didn't see Anthony anywhere. Had he somehow made bail overnight? That seemed unlikely. 2 cases later, the court clerk announced, "Next case, review of wrongful detention, file PD 4387. Judge Chen looked up. "Is the arresting officer present?" Rickard recognized the case number. It was his arrest from yesterday. He raised his hand. "Here, Your Honor." "And counsel for the detained?" The main doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Heads turned as footsteps echoed down the center aisle. Rickard glanced back, expecting to see some overworked public defender. Instead, Anthony Washington walked confidently toward the front of the courtroom. He wore a fresh suit, charcoal gray with a blue tie, looking nothing like the rumpled, rain-soaked man from yesterday. Most surprisingly, he wasn't approaching from the side entrance where defendants were brought in from holding. Anthony nodded politely to several people as he passed. A court clerk smiled at him. A senior attorney patted his shoulder. Rickard's stomach began to knot as he watched this bizarre scene unfold. But it was when Anthony reached the front of the courtroom that Rickard's world truly tilted. "Good morning, Federal Prosecutor Washington," Judge Chen said warmly. "I didn't expect to see you in my courtroom today. Aren't you handling the Taylor case upstairs?" Anthony smiled. "I am, Your Honor, but I find myself involved in an unusual situation that requires your attention first." The blood drained from Rickard's face as the realization hit him like a physical blow. Federal prosecutor. The man he'd arrested, the man he'd mocked and locked in a holding cell for 6 hours, was a federal prosecutor. "I believe Officer Rickard can explain why I was detained yesterday," Anthony continued, turning to look directly at Rickard. His expression was calm, but his eyes held the weight of righteous anger. Judge Chen turned to Rickard with raised eyebrows. "Officer, would you care to explain why you arrested a federal prosecutor and held him without access to a phone call for 6 hours?" The courtroom had gone deadly quiet. Rickard felt dozens of eyes boring into him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. I didn't know," he finally managed to stammer. He matched the description of a robbery suspect. "And what was this description?" Judge Chen asked, her voice sharp. Rickard swallowed hard. "Black male, well-dressed, driving an expensive vehicle." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Chen's expression hardened. "So you arrested a man based on his race and the fact that he drove a nice car?" "No, Your Honor, there were other factors." "Actually," Anthony interrupted smoothly, "I have the arrest report right here." He placed a document on the judge's bench. "You'll note the only identifying characteristics listed are exactly what Officer Rickard just stated." Judge Chen reviewed the document, her frown deepening. "Officer Rickard, this is deeply troubling. Not only have you potentially violated Mr. Washington's civil rights, but you've interfered with a federal investigation by detaining him without cause." Anthony turned to face the courtroom, his voice clear and measured. "I'd like to move for immediate dismissal of all charges, Your Honor, and I reserve the right to pursue further action regarding this incident." "Granted," Judge Chen said without hesitation. "Officer Rickard, I suggest you meet with your superior immediately. This court will be forwarding documentation of this incident to the Internal Affairs Division." As Anthony gathered his papers, his eyes met Rickard's once more. In that moment, Rickard saw something beyond anger. He saw determination. This wasn't going to end here in this courtroom. This was just the beginning. The officer who had been so confident minutes before now stood frozen, watching as his career began crumbling around him, all because he'd brought the wrong black man to court. The hallway outside courtroom 3 hummed with whispered conversations. News of what had happened inside was already spreading through the courthouse like wildfire. Court clerks, attorneys, and even other officers huddled in small groups, stealing glances at Officer Rickard as he stood alone by a water fountain, his face still pale with shock. Anthony emerged from the courtroom, phone in hand, already making calls to reschedule the meetings he'd missed. Several colleagues approached him with concerned expressions, but he assured them with a quick nod that he was handling the situation. He spotted Rickard by the water fountain and paused mid-conversation. "Let me call you back," he said into his phone before sliding it into his pocket. Rickard saw him coming and straightened his posture, trying to regain some semblance of dignity. The hallway quieted as Anthony approached him, that confrontation drawing curious eyes. "Officer Rickard," Anthony said, his voice level but carrying in the now hushed corridor. "Do you have a moment to talk?" Rickard glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the audience they'd attracted. Look, it was an honest mistake. These things happen in the line of duty. These things, Anthony repeated. His calm tone somehow made the question more pointed than if he'd shouted it. "You mean wrongful arrests based on nothing more than skin color and a nice car?" "That's not fair," Rickard protested, lowering his voice. "We had a description so vague it could have matched thousands of people in this city," Anthony cut in. "This isn't the first time you've done this, is it?" The question hung in the air between them. Rickard's eyes darted around, looking for an escape route, but he was cornered, both physically and metaphorically. "I follow protocol," Rickard insisted, his defensiveness growing. "I make split-second decisions to keep this community safe." "Safe for whom?" Anthony asked. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, watching the exchange with undisguised interest. "Because from where I stand, it seems some citizens are presumed dangerous until proven innocent, while others are given the benefit of every doubt." Rickard's jaw tightened. "You don't know what it's like out there. You sit in your fancy office while I grew up 6 blocks from where you pulled me over," Anthony said quietly. "I know exactly what it's like out there. The difference is, I don't use that as an excuse to violate people's rights." A heavy-set man in a police captain's uniform approached, his expression grim. "Officer Rickard," he said, "we need to talk." He turned to Anthony with an apologetic nod. "Mr. Washington, on behalf of the department, I want to express—" "Save it, Captain Reed," Anthony replied, recognizing the department's head of public relations. "This isn't about one apology for one incident. This is about a pattern of behavior." Rickard's face flushed. "Pattern? You're going to ruin my career over one mistake." "Was it just one mistake?" Anthony asked, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm going to review every arrest you've made in the past 5 years, every traffic stop, every search, every detention. I'm going to analyze the racial breakdown, the conviction rates, the complaints filed." Rickard paled again. "You can't do that." "Actually, I can," Anthony said. "As a federal prosecutor investigating potential civil rights violations, I have not only the authority but the obligation to do exactly that." Captain Reed stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "Mr. Washington, perhaps we could discuss this privately in my office." "This isn't going away with a private conversation, Captain," Anthony replied. "Unlike most people Officer Rickard wrongfully detains, I have the resources and position to ensure accountability." A young officer who had been watching approached hesitantly. "Sir," she said, addressing Anthony, "I was there yesterday when they brought you in. I'm the one who finally got you your phone call." It was the sympathetic female officer from the station. "I remember," Anthony said, his tone softening slightly. "There are good cops who want to do right," she said quietly. "Some of us have tried to report problems, but—" She glanced nervously at Captain Reed and didn't finish her sentence. Anthony studied her for a moment, then pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "If you have information that could be relevant to my investigation, call this number." Rickard watched this exchange with growing alarm. "You're asking officers to turn against their own. That's crossing a line." "The line was crossed the moment you decided some people deserve protection under the law and others don't," Anthony replied. Captain Reed stepped between them. "Officer Rickard, that's enough. Report to my office immediately." He turned to Anthony. "Mr. Washington, I assure you we take this matter very seriously." "I'm counting on it," Anthony said, "because the Justice Department will be taking it seriously as well." As Rickard was led away by his superior, he glanced back at Anthony with a mixture of fear and resentment. The power dynamic that had existed between them just 24 hours ago had been completely reversed. Anthony watched them go, then noticed a middle-aged black woman who had been standing nearby throughout the confrontation. She approached him with a knowing look. "My brother spent 3 nights in jail last year because of that man," she said quietly. "Nobody listened then." Anthony nodded solemnly. "They're listening now." He turned to walk away, already mentally organizing the investigation he was about to launch. This wasn't just about one wrongful arrest anymore. This was about changing a system that allowed officers like Rickard to operate with impunity for far too long. Behind him, the courthouse continued to buzz with the news of what had happened. By tomorrow, it would be in the papers. By next week, it would be on the desks of police officials and city leaders. The clock was ticking on Officer Rickard's career and on the broken system that had protected him. Anthony's office looked like a war room 2 weeks after the incident. Stacks of folders covered every surface. A large whiteboard was filled with timelines and statistics, and 3 junior attorneys worked at a makeshift table that had been brought in to accommodate the growing investigation. "Another box just arrived from records," said Tina, the most experienced of the junior attorneys, placing a heavy cardboard box on the only clear spot on Anthony's desk. "This one has Rickard's traffic stops from 2020 to 2021. Anthony nodded, rubbing his tired eyes. He'd been working late every night, combing through arrest records, dash cam footage, and civilian complaints. The picture emerging was worse than he'd initially suspected. "Let's add it to the database," he said, opening the box to reveal hundreds of neatly filed traffic citations. "I want every stop categorized by driver description, reason for the stop, and outcome." On his computer screen, a spreadsheet already showed the preliminary analysis of 3 years' worth of data. The numbers were stark. Black drivers were 6 times more likely to be searched after being pulled over by Rickard compared to white drivers. Even more telling, those searches yielded contraband at a lower rate than searches of white drivers, evidence that the searches weren't based on actual suspicious behavior, but on bias. Anthony's phone rang. "Washington," he answered. "Mr. Washington, this is Officer Chen," came a female voice. It was the young officer who had given him her phone call at the station and later approached him in the courthouse. "I have some information you might want to see." 30 minutes later, Officer Chen sat across from Anthony, nervously glancing at the door every few minutes. "I shouldn't be here," she said quietly, placing a flash drive on the desk. "But this isn't right. These are the body cam videos that were lost from the system. I made copies before they disappeared." Anthony picked up the flash drive. "Lost." Some officers know how to mark footage for automatic deletion before it gets reviewed. It's against policy, but it happens. She looked down at her hands. "Especially when the footage might show problematic behavior." "Thank you for bringing this forward," Anthony said. "I understand the risk you're taking." She nodded. "There's something else. I've been talking to some of the people Rickard has arrested. There's a man named David Torres. He was arrested last year, same situation as you, driving a nice car, matching a vague description. He lost his job because of it, couldn't make bail for 3 days. His case was eventually dismissed, but the damage was done." Anthony wrote down the name. "Would he be willing to talk to us?" "He's scared, but I think so, and he's not the only one." She handed Anthony a handwritten list of names. "These are just the ones I know about personally." After Officer Chen left, Anthony called his team together. The whiteboard now had 7 names listed under similar cases, people who had experienced wrongful arrests with striking parallels to his own. "We need to interview each of these people," he told the team. "Document everything. Photos of their vehicles, exact descriptions given by Rickard, time spent in detention." Taina studied the growing evidence wall. "This goes beyond just Rickard, doesn't it? Someone's been covering for him." Anthony nodded grimly. "The complaint files show at least 12 formal complaints filed against him over the years, all dismissed as unfounded or buried in paperwork." "By whom?" asked one of the junior attorneys. "That's what we need to find out," Anthony replied, turning to look at a photo of Captain Reed that they'd pinned to the board with a question mark beside it. The investigation expanded over the following weeks. Anthony's team conducted dozens of interviews, analyzed thousands of records, and compiled statistical evidence that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. The body cam footage from Officer Chen proved invaluable, showing Rickard's demeanor changing dramatically depending on the race of the driver he pulled over. One evening, as Anthony was reviewing deposition transcripts, his office door opened. The district attorney, Lisa Powell, entered with a concerned expression. "Anthony, we need to talk about this Rickard investigation," she said, closing the door behind her. "I'm hearing it's taking up a lot of resources." "It's necessary," Anthony replied, gesturing to the evidence covering his office. "This isn't just about one bad cop, Lisa. There's a systemic issue here." She sighed, taking a seat. "The police union is getting nervous. I've had 3 calls from their lawyer this week alone." "Good," Anthony said. "They should be nervous." "You need to tread carefully," she cautioned. "These kinds of investigations can get messy, political, career-defining." Anthony leaned forward. "Someone needs to do it. These people had their lives turned upside down because of profiling, and no one was listening." Powell studied him for a moment. "Just make sure your case is airtight. You're taking on more than just Officer Rickard here." After she left, Anthony turned back to the whiteboard where they'd mapped out the chain of command that had protected Rickard over the years. At the top was the name of the police chief himself. Anthony's phone buzzed with a text from Officer Chen. "Torres will talk." meeting set for tomorrow." He texted back a quick thanks, then returned to the mountain of evidence. The investigation had grown far beyond his personal experience. This was about justice for every person who had been wrongfully targeted but lacked the power to fight back. As he reviewed the statistics one more time, Anthony felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. In 3 months, he would present his findings at a formal hearing, and the truth would finally come to light, not just about one officer, but about a system that had failed too many for too long.